I just watched Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, and well, that was definitely a movie. For anyone who hasn't seen the film and doesn't know what I'm talking about, Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman follows the life of Dr. William Moulton Marston, the creator of possibly the most famous female superhero of all time, Wonder Woman. While his career as a comic book writer probably wouldn't be enough to carry a film on its own, Dr. Marston had a very unusual life, especially for the time period where he lived. Not only did he maintain a secret polygamous relationship with 2 women, but Marston also had an interest in bondage, not to mention some fairly out there philosophical and psychological beliefs. Because of this, the film tends to focus more on the surreal elements of Marston's life, even going so far as to embellish certain aspects of his story. But exactly how much the film is fabricated and how much is true? Well, let's take a look and find out. This is Movie V.S History, Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman. The film begins with Professor Marston, along with his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Marston, teaching a class at what we later find out is Radcliffe College. During one of his lectures, Dr. Marston meets a particularly enthusiastic student named Olive Byrne, who puts herself forward to be his lab assistant. Now, there are a few things wrong with this opening scene, but let's just start with the college that Olive attends. Radcliffe was the sister college to Harvard University, as in 1925, the year that Professor Marston first met Olive Byrne, women still weren't allowed to attend Harvard. While the Radcliffe College represented by the film is clearly a women's only institution, either that or Dr. Marston's class was just incredibly appealing to women, and given the subject matter that he taught, that's very possible. This doesn't change the fact that Olive Byrne did not attend Radcliffe College. In fact, Olive Byrne first met Professor Marston while attending Tufts College, a women's college in Medford, Massachusetts. Marston's position within the faculty is also incorrect, as Phil Marston is a fully fledged professor of psychology rather than an assistant professor of philosophy as he was in real life. I should probably clarify that the real-life Dr. Marston did in fact have a doctorate in psychology as well as a doctorate in law, but because the field of psychology is actually an offshoot of philosophy, Marston was able to finagle his way into a job as a philosophy professor. While it's true that Dr. Marston is credited with creating the lie detector test, just as in the film's representation of when, where, and how this happened is completely incorrect. Marston first wrote Elizabeth about his idea to use blood pressure to detect deception while in his junior year at Harvard University, around 1915. The two then embarked on an experiment to test this theory, where they gathered a group of 10 test subjects, each of which were asked to read a story involving a friend of theirs who committed a crime. After each reading, Marston, who was situated behind a barrier to ensure that he was not tipped off by the subjects' faces, then asked them how they would go about saving their friend and if they should lie in order to do so. During all this, the subjects were hooked up to a blood pressure cuff attached to a machine that printed out the results of the test on graph paper, basically the first lie detector. Marston then questioned the same 10 subjects about the fictional crime in front of a jury composed completely of psychology students. During the fake proceedings, Marston asked the jury to try to determine whether or not the subjects were telling the truth by examining the subject's face and voice, while he used only the data from his lie detector. The results of this experiment were staggering, as Marston's lie detector test had a much higher rate of accuracy, with a 96% success rate compared to the jury's 50%. The reality of Marston's Harvard experiment is quite different from the story presented to us by the film, as not only did these experiments take place 10 years before Marston first met Olive Byrne, but the movie also chooses to substitute the aforementioned experiment with numerous sexually charged lie detector interrogations. One thing that the film definitely got right, however, is that Marston benefited very little from the invention of the lie detector test, as he never patented his test or the machine he cobbled together to make it work. That honor went to a man named Leonard, yes I know it's a strange name, Keeler, who coined the term polygraph and patented his version of the machine in 1931. Dr. Elizabeth Marston, played in the film by Rebecca Hall, is very close in both appearance and attitude to her real-world counterpart. In addition to her short brown hair, slim figure, and boisterous attitude, the character also sports an English accent despite growing up in Massachusetts. I should probably mention that the real Elizabeth Marston was born on the Isle of Man, a small British-owned chunk of land in the middle of the Irish Sea, where she frequently summered as a child, thus helping to maintain her English accent. The only difference between film Elizabeth and her real-world counterpart is in relation to her career. When we first meet Elizabeth in the films, she is acting in the role of Marston's assistant, and complains that her license to teach has been denied. Later on, after losing their position at the university, Elizabeth, despite her extensive education, has trouble finding employment and settles for working as a secretary. This could not be further from the truth, as the real Elizabeth Marston was gainfully employed many times throughout her professional career, and was often the sole financial supporter in the Marston household. While she initially found employment as a clerk working in the law office, the blatant sexism of her employers discouraged her from continuing a career in law. After a brief law career in January of 1926, she took a job working as an editor for the magazine Child Study, and then went on to become chief editor for the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Phil Marston mentions briefly that he served in World War I as part of the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services. This is a bit puzzling because while it's true that Marston served in World War I, it's also true that the Office of Strategic Services did not exist until 1942. Marston signed up to serve in 1917, but despite numerous attempts to get the army on board with using his deception research, he was turned down by almost all branches of the government, including the Department of War, the Department of Justice, and the Office of Military Intelligence. He eventually was given a position teaching at the Army School of Military Psychology at Camp Greenleaf, and spent a fair bit of time in the service traveling to different camps and treating people for psychological ailments, like shell shock, until his honorable discharge in 1919. Olive Byrne's boyfriend, or fiancé, or whatever the hell he was supposed to be, is just perfectly pointless, both historically and in terms of the movie's plot. During my research, I came across no mention of Olive ever having a boyfriend while she was attending Tufts College. This makes sense, as not only was Tufts College a women's institution, as mentioned previously, but Olive's heavy course load, combined with her wealth of extracurricular activities, and the fact that she started her first semester 2 weeks late, would have made it very difficult for her to find time to date. In addition to being historically inaccurate, the fiancé, boyfriend, and yes I know he has a real name, but I cannot be bothered to remember it, has no real relevance to the story other than expressing his disapproval of Olive and her relationship with Dr. and Dr. Marston. In the film, during a particularly heated lie detector test, it's revealed that Olive has feelings for Elizabeth Marston. While I'm sure that scenes like these helped to get butts in seats when the film was in theaters, to my knowledge this relationship has no real basis in reality. While many people have suggested that the two women have shared a more intimate relationship, an idea that was more than likely bolstered by the fact that Marston openly encouraged emotional and physical relationships between women, there's no proof that such a relationship ever existed. The pair did live together until Olive's death in 1985, but it's just likely that they remained together out of friendship, as by the time of Marston's death in 1947, they had spent around 20 years living together and raising a family, so it's understandable why they became attached. But as William, Elizabeth, and Olive are now dead, the only thing I can say for certain regarding the relationship between these two women is that we may never know. According to the movie, not long after Dr. and Dr. Marston are fired from their position at the university, they are hit with even more surprising news, that Olive Byrne is pregnant. While this revelation definitely helps to up the drama in the film, the fact of the matter is that Elizabeth was actually the first woman in the Marston household to have a child, little Pete Marston, in 1928, almost 3 years after Marston was fired from Tufts College in 1925. Little Pete was then followed by Olive's sons, Byrne and Dawn, in 1931 and 32, and Elizabeth's daughter Olive Ann Marston in 1933. As Elizabeth was the main breadwinner in the family, Olive, not unlike her film counterpart, became the family's primary caregiver, spending the majority of her time taking care of the Marston household and 4 children. However, despite the difficulties associated with being a homemaker and mother of 4, Olive still found time to write articles for Family Circle magazine, her favorite subject being the eccentric psychologist and comic book writer, Dr. William Moulton Marston. In the film, Dr. Marston's interest in comic books first developed out of a desire to transmit his notions and ideas regarding behavior and the nature of relationships to the masses. He just goes straight down to DC Comics, or All American Comics as it was then known, and sells his comic to the head honcho himself, Max Gaines, played in the film by Oliver Platt. In reality, however, Marston started out working as a member of the All American Comics Editorial Advisory Board, to help alleviate the fears of concerned parents who worried that comic books might rot their child's brain. DC and other comic book companies set up advisory boards filled with experts such as psychologists, doctors, and child behaviorists, whose job it was to inspect their comic books and determine whether or not they were hazardous. Marston's time on the advisory board introduced him to the fact that the comic book industry was kind of a sausage fest, as there were very few prominent female superheroes to speak of. Thus, to counterbalance the overdose of testosterone in the comic book industry, Marston pitched his own female superhero called Suprema the Wonder Woman, a title that he wisely decided to shorten after a suggestion from Max Gaines. At one point in the film, Marston equates Wonder Woman's magic lasso with the lie detector, a mistake that it seems people have been making for decades. In reality, Marston went on record stating that the magic lasso was actually a symbol of the feminine charm and allure that every woman possesses. Thus, every woman had her own lasso, and every woman could be a Wonder Woman. One of the most ludicrous scenes in the entire movie, in relation to both historical accuracy and just plain common sense, has to be the big reveal scene. Apparently, the writers of this film didn't think that it was at all unreasonable to believe that a group of people, dead set on hiding their secret life from the rest of the world, would leave their front door open so that neighbors could just walk in and find them doing things. This discovery leads to yet another persecution moment, where the Marstons are shunned by their neighbors for being freaks, and Elizabeth decides that even though this is technically the first time they've ever been outed, that enough is enough and Olive and her kids have to move out. While I've found no evidence that this incident ever occurred, I would also assume that a household full of highly educated college graduates could figure out how to lock a door. In the film, we see scenes depicting people collecting and burning comic books. As insane as this seems, comic book burnings were a thing that actually happened, but not during Marston's lifetime. According to the book Wonder Woman Unbound, the curious history of the world's most famous heroine, back in the 1930s, educational and parental groups had problems with comic books, but their ire was more of the angry letter-writing variety, and was calmed by advisory panels. After the Senate hearing, several municipal governments across America banned comic books outright, and there were even comic book burnings. This quote is referring to the 1954 hearings held by the Senate Subcommittee for Juvenile Delinquency. At this point, the American comic book industry had, for the most part, stopped producing superhero comics, putting all their focus on instead creating horror comics. These comics, though quite popular, were also very graphic and disturbing, prompting outcries from concerned parents, and eventually the development of the aforementioned Senate hearings. The hearings then led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which I'll talk about more later, and a return to producing superhero comics, which were a lot tamer in comparison. The film ends with Marston revealing his secret identity as the creator of Wonder Woman. The only problem is that it occurs in 1945, a few years after the real Dr. Marston revealed his secret identity in 1942. Unlike his film counterparts, Dr. William Moulton Marston loved being in the spotlight, so after Wonder Woman became a hit, he wasted no time informing the world that he was in fact the true creator of the beloved Amazon princess. Even the facts listed at the very end of the film have inaccuracies. Well, okay, most of the facts, to my knowledge, are correct. Dr. Marston did die of cancer in 1947, Olive Byrne and Dr. Elizabeth Marston did live together until Olive's death in 1985, with Elizabeth living another 8 years and dying in 1993 at age 100. Holy hell, that is one determined woman. But I have issue with the very last fact in that list, which reads that after Marston's death, Wonder Woman was stripped of her powers. While Wonder Woman would eventually be stripped of her powers, it did not happen right after Marston's death. Instead, the changes happened much more gradually. After Marston's death, in 1947, the job of writing Wonder Woman comics fell to a man named Robert Kanigher, who initially tried to stay true to Marston's vision and even gave Wonder Woman new powers, like the ability to fly, which she hadn't possessed during Marston's run. Despite Kanigher's attempts to stay true to Marston's vision, however, his run as writer saw the introduction of several changes, like the death of Wonder Woman's sidekick, Etta Candy. Then, in 1954, the comic book industry went through a drastic change, as the introduction of the Comics Code Authority made it very difficult for Wonder Woman comics to include anything that passed as cruelty, lust, sadism, or masochism, meaning that the bondage scenes that helped to make the comic so popular had to be cut. Despite these changes, Kanigher continued to write for Wonder Woman until 1968, when he was eventually replaced as writer by Denny O'Neil, and it's at this time that Wonder Woman was stripped of her powers. In the first comic of O'Neil's run, it was explained that the Amazons were going to another dimension to recharge their magical powers. But because Wonder Woman couldn't bring herself to leave her boyfriend, Steve Trevor, she decided to stay on Earth, giving up her powers to do so. This no-power phase didn't last long, however, as in 1972, the first issue of Ms. Magazine announced that Wonder Woman would be returning to her Amazon route. One of the first scenes in the film shows Marston being interviewed by Josette Frank of the Child Study Association of America. Though it may be hard to tell from her depiction in the film, Josette Frank was widely in favor of comic books, but drew the line at Wonder Woman as she objected to both the character's lack of clothing as well as the comic's quote-unquote sadism. She wrote a letter to Max Gaines explaining her concerns regarding the Wonder Woman comic, but the letter was simply brushed off by Marston, who stated that Frank was a lightweight and that Wonder Woman had more than enough support to keep going. While Frank's film counterpart and her disapproval of Wonder Woman definitely comes from a real place, on the other hand, I have no evidence that the interview with Marston depicted in the film actually occurred. The film gives viewers a brief explanation of Marston's disc theory, or dominance, inducement, submission, and completion theory. This theory, which was published in Marston's book, Emotions of Normal People, in 1928, endeavors to explain human relationships by dividing them into two binary relationships: active versus passive, and favorable versus antagonistic. In the first relationship, active versus passive, one individual within the relationship holds all the dominance, forcing their more passive partner to comply with their demands. According to Marston, this is the dynamic to avoid, as most problem relationships could be characterized as active versus passive. In a favorable versus antagonistic relationship, however, the active participant coerces the partner into submission, resulting in a much more pleasurable experience for both participants. In addition to including this theory, the film also references Marston's thoughts regarding women and their natural aptitude for using coercion to control their significant other when in a relationship, thus creating a dynamic that is considered much more healthy. So basically, a happy relationship is one where the woman is in charge, at least according to Marston. The infamous baby party scene, where Olive allows Marston to observe a hazing ritual performed by her sorority, is, believe it or not, very similar to real-world events. During the aforementioned baby party, pledges to Olive's fraternity, Alpha Omicron Pi, were forced to dress up as babies and perform tasks while being hit with long sticks. This event apparently had such an impact on Marston that he decided to feature a similar scene in Wonder Woman. In one issue, Etta Candy and the members of her sorority, Beta Lambda, forced their underlings to dress up as babies for an entire week. Marston's presence at the baby party may even have been the reason why his employment with Tufts College was terminated, as just like in the film, he was fired after teaching there for yet less than a year. Just like in the film, Olive Byrne's mother, Ethel Byrne, and Aunt Margaret Sanger were both deeply involved in the birth control movement, a fact which earned them quite a bit of acclaim among the more liberal-minded individuals of their generation. The two women ended up having a falling out, but Margaret Sanger continued her work with the movement, and eventually even married a millionaire to help fund her cause, which is why Marston talks about her being rich in the film. Unfortunately, Ethel Byrne's preoccupation with the birth control movement, combined with her husband's lack of parenting skills or compassion for his children, forced Ethel to place her daughter in a convent school when she was growing up. Though many of the accounts that I've read regarding Olive's time at school make it sound like her experience there was relatively pleasant. A happy childhood spent in a convent school. Well, doesn't that beat all? Just like in the film, in order to waylay any suspicions regarding her living arrangements with Dr. and Dr. Marston, Olive Byrne married an imaginary man named William K. Richard on November 21st, 1928. Also around this time, Olive began wearing a pair of close-fitting, wide-band metal bracelets. These bracelets, which are worn by Bella Heathcote in the film, were given to Olive by Marston to wear in place of a wedding ring, and were also the inspiration for Wonder Woman's bolt-deflecting bracelets. Not unlike his film counterpart, Max Gaines did work as a public school principal before starting a career in the comic book industry. It was also Gaines who suggested that Marston shorten the name of his protagonist from Suprema the Wonder Woman to just Wonder Woman. Also, just like in the film, Marston wrote Wonder Woman comics under the pseudonym of Charles Moulton, a title that was actually a combination of both he and Max Gaines' middle names. Marston's Wonder Woman comics featured quite a lot of what would be referred to today as bondage, a fact which generated a fair bit of contempt from parents even during the more relaxed golden age of comics. Marston's use of bondage, as well as his reluctance to reduce the frequency of such scenes in his comics, is touched on in the film, along with Marston's explanation as to why such scenes were important. Namely that they taught young boys to submit to the loving authority of women, who Marston believed would one day rule the world. On a related note, the National League of Decency mentioned in the film is a clear reference to the National Organization for Decent Literature, a group created by a committee of Catholic bishops in 1938. This organization was dedicated to rooting out indecency in literature, and just like in the film, Wonder Woman found her way onto their blacklist in 1942, due to her lack of sufficient clothing. This film, like many I've reviewed, is competently made, shot, and acted. All that's missing is the truth in the true story that it's supposed to be representing. While some nuggets of truth do make it into the film, ultimately Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman is far more interested in cashing in on the strange, sexually charged life of a famous comic book creator than presenting the facts as they actually happened. If this review has piqued your interest and you want to check out this movie for yourself, then by all means do so. But if you're interested in finding out more about the life of Dr. William Moulton Marston or the history of Wonder Woman comics, then please check out the books featured in the credits. Well, this has been Silver Jade saying see you later, and don't forget to support your local library.